The sun burned like a merciless eye across the Arizona territory, casting long shadows behind the rocky outcrops where Jake Morrison crouched with his rifle. His weathered hands gripped the weapon tight as he watched the Apache war party moving through the valley below. 3 days they had been tracking him, and 3 days he had managed to stay ahead of their horses and their anger. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead with a dirty sleeve. His water was nearly gone, his horse had thrown a shoe 2 days back, and now he was on foot in country that wanted to kill him. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was running from the very people whose land he had helped steal. But that was before. Before he learned what kind of man his boss really was. Before he saw what they did to the Apache children. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Colonel Harrington's voice echoing across the army camp, "No witnesses, Morrison. Not even the young ones." The smell of smoke and gunpowder. The screaming that stopped too suddenly. Jake had been a soldier, had done things in war that haunted his sleep, but what happened at that Apache settlement wasn't war. It was something else entirely. He had tried to stop it. Pulled his gun on his own commanding officer when he saw what they planned to do to the children they had captured. For that act of conscience, he was now a deserter with a price on his head and a death sentence from both sides. The army wanted him for treason, and the Apache wanted him for the massacre he had tried to prevent. Down in the valley, the war party had stopped. Jake counted 7 warriors, their painted faces turned toward his hiding place like they could smell his fear on the desert wind. Their leader, a tall man with silver decorating his black hair, raised his hand and pointed directly at Jake's position. Somehow, they knew he was there. Jake's mind raced through his options. He could try to pick them off from up here, but 7 against 1 meant he would die on this rocky hill. He could run, but his boots were nearly worn through and he wouldn't make it a mile before they rode him down. Or he could surrender and hope they would give him a quick death instead of the slow one he probably deserved. The decision was made for him when a rifle shot cracked across the desert and stone exploded inches from his head. They weren't interested in talking. Jake rolled behind a larger boulder as more shots rang out, the bullets whining off the rocks around him. He could hear the thunder of hooves as the warriors spurred their horses up the steep slope toward his position. Jake took careful aim and fired, watching one of the Apache warriors tumble from his horse. The others scattered, using the sparse desert vegetation for cover as they continued their advance. Another shot, and Jake saw his bullet strike home, but there were still too many of them and they were getting closer. His ammunition was running low. Jake counted the remaining cartridges in his gun belt, 8 shots left. Not enough. Not nearly enough. He thought about the letter in his shirt pocket, the one he had written but never sent to his sister back in Kansas. It told her everything, about the massacre, about why he had run, about how sorry he was for all the things he had done in his life. She would never read it now. The Apache were close enough that he could hear them calling to each other in their own language. Jake didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. They were coordinating their final attack. Soon they would rush his position from multiple directions and it would be over. That's when he heard something that made his blood freeze. Hi, terrified voices calling out from somewhere below. Children's voices. Apache children. Jake risked a look around the boulder and felt his heart sink. 2 young Apache girls, maybe 10 and 12 years old, were trapped on a narrow ledge about 50 feet down the cliff face. They must have been trying to climb up to escape something, a flash flood, maybe, or wild animals, and now they were stuck. The ledge was crumbling under their weight, and Jake could see loose rocks falling into the canyon below every time they moved. The warriors had heard them too. Their leader was shouting something urgent, and Jake could see the panic in the man's movements. These weren't just any children, they meant something special to these men. Maybe they were family. Maybe they were the last of their people. Jake didn't know, but he could see that the men below were torn between their desire to kill him and their desperate need to save those girls. One of the warriors started climbing down toward the ledge, but the rock face was too unstable. More stones broke away, and the girls screamed as their foothold grew smaller. The warrior had to retreat or risk bringing the whole section of cliff down on top of them. Jake closed his eyes and thought about the children at the settlement. The ones he had failed to save. The ones whose deaths would follow him to his grave. He thought about orders and duty and all the excuses men used to avoid doing what they knew was right. Then, he thought about his sister's letter, the one where she wrote that she was proud to have a brother who always tried to help people, even when it was hard. Maybe especially when it was hard. Jake stood up slowly, his rifle held high over his head in surrender. The Apache warriors immediately trained their weapons on him, but they didn't fire. Their leader shouted something that sounded like a question. Jake couldn't understand the words, but he could guess what the man was asking. The girls, Jake called out in English, pointing toward the ledge. Let me help them. The Apache leader's face was a mask of suspicion and rage, but Jake could see the desperation in his eyes. Those children were dying, and he was the only one in position to reach them. Jake pointed to himself, then to the ledge, then made a gesture like he was pulling someone up. The universal language of rescue. For a long moment, nobody moved. The desert wind whipped between them, carrying the sound of the girls' frightened voices. Then, the leader lowered his rifle slightly and said something to his men. They kept their weapons trained on Jake, but they didn't shoot as he began to move toward the cliff edge. Jake had done some climbing in his younger days, back when he was surveying railroad routes through the Colorado mountains. The skills came back to him as he studied the rock face, looking for handholds and testing each step before putting his full weight on it. The Apache warriors watched him like hawks, ready to put a bullet in him if he tried anything clever. But Jake wasn't thinking about escape anymore. All his attention was focused on the two frightened faces looking up at him from the crumbling ledge below. The older girl was trying to comfort the younger one, but Jake could see that they were both terrified. Blood streaked the older girl's forehead where falling rocks had cut her, and the younger one's dress was torn from trying to cling to the rough stone. It's okay, Jake called down to them in English, knowing they probably couldn't understand him but hoping his tone would be reassuring. I'm coming to get you. He began his descent, moving carefully from handhold to handhold. The rock was treacherous, weathered by years of wind and rain into something more like sand than solid stone. Twice his foot slipped and he had to catch himself, feeling his heart hammer against his ribs as loose stones clattered into the abyss below. The girls watched him come, their dark eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. As Jake got closer, he could see intricate tattoos or paint markings on their faces and arms, traditional Apache decorations that marked them as special within their tribe. No wonder the warriors were so desperate to save them. Jake was still 20 feet above the ledge when he heard the ominous crack of breaking stone. The girl's refuge was giving way. The younger girl screamed and pressed herself against the cliff face as a large chunk of rock broke away and tumbled into the canyon. The ledge was now barely wide enough for one person, and it wouldn't hold much longer. Hold on! Jake shouted, abandoning caution as he scrambled down the remaining distance. His boots hit the ledge just as another section crumbled away, leaving all three of them balanced on a narrow strip of stone that couldn't have been more than 2 feet wide. Up close, Jake could see that the girls were even younger than he had thought. The older one might have been 12, but the smaller girl couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. Their traditional clothing was richly decorated with beadwork and symbols that spoke of high status within their tribe. These were someone's precious daughters, maybe even the children of a chief. The older girl said something to him in Apache, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Jake didn't understand the words, but her meaning was clear. She wanted him to save her little sister first. The same protective instinct that Jake had seen in soldiers on the battlefield, the same love that made people sacrifice themselves for others. Jake pointed up the cliff face and, then, at the younger girl, trying to communicate his plan. He would carry the small one on his back while she held tight, then, come back for the older sister. But, the girl shook her head frantically and pointed to specific markings on the younger child's arms and face. She was trying to tell him something important about those decorations, something that Jake couldn't understand but that seemed crucial. Another crack echoed through the canyon as more of the ledge gave way. There wasn't time for complex communication. Jake motioned for the older girl to climb onto his back, figuring he could carry more weight than the smaller child could. But, again she refused, this time grabbing the younger girl and pushing her toward Jake with urgent words in Apache. The little girl looked terrified but obedient as she wrapped her arms around Jake's neck. Her grip was surprisingly strong for someone so small, and Jake could feel her trembling against his back as he began the dangerous climb upward. Every movement had to be carefully calculated, one wrong step would send all three of them tumbling into the canyon. Halfway up, Jake's left boot found a weak spot in the rock and punched through, leaving his leg dangling over empty air. The sudden jolt nearly shook the girl from his back, but she held on with grim determination. Jake could hear the older sister calling encouragement from below, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air despite the distance. Jake pulled his leg free and found new handholds, continuing the agonizing climb toward the top of the cliff. His arms burned with exhaustion and his lungs felt like they were full of sand, but the weight of the child on his back kept him focused. This was what mattered. This was why he had broken ranks with Colonel Harrington. This was why he had chosen to become a deserter rather than a child killer. The Apache warriors were waiting when Jake finally pulled himself and the girl over the edge of the cliff. Their weapons were still trained on him, but something in their expressions had changed. The desperate fury was still there, but it was mixed now with something that might have been respect. Or at least recognition that Jake was trying to help rather than harm. The little girl slipped from Jake's back and ran to one of the warriors, her father, Jake realized, seeing the resemblance in their features and the relief that flooded the man's face as he gathered her into his arms. The warrior spoke rapidly to her in Apache, and she answered with what sounded like an account of the rescue, pointing back toward the cliff edge where her sister still waited. Jake was already preparing for his second descent when the Apache leader approached him. The man's face was still hard as granite, but he reached out and touched Jake's shoulder in what might have been a gesture of grudging thanks. Then, he said something in heavily accented English that made Jake's blood run cold. "You save her sister. Then, you die." Jake nodded his understanding. He had known this was how it would end. The Apache had every right to their revenge, and Jake had done too many terrible things in his life to expect mercy now. But, at least he would die knowing he had saved these children. At least his last act would be one of rescue rather than destruction. As Jake prepared for his second trip down the cliff face, he noticed something that made him pause. The little girl he had just rescued was tugging on her father's sleeve and pointing at specific markings on her own arms, then gesturing toward Jake. She was trying to tell the man something urgent, something about the decorative patterns painted or tattooed on her skin. The warrior listened to his daughter with growing amazement, then looked at Jake with new eyes. He called out to his companions in Apache, and Jake heard his own name mentioned several times in their rapid conversation. Whatever the girl was telling them, it was having a profound effect on the warriors' attitude toward their prisoner. But, there wasn't time to wonder about Apache politics or customs. The older girl was still trapped on the disintegrating ledge below, and Jake could hear rocks falling as her refuge continued to crumble. He started his second descent, moving as quickly as safety would allow. This time the climb was even more dangerous. The rock face had been further weakened by his previous trip, and handholds that had been solid before now crumbled under his weight. Jake had to test each grip twice before trusting it, and, even then, he could feel the stone shifting beneath his fingers. The girl on the ledge watched him approach with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. When Jake finally reached her, she spoke to him in clear English that caught him completely off guard. "You are the one who tried to save the children at Blue Creek Settlement," she said. "My cousin saw you pull your gun on the soldier chief." Jake stared at her in shock. This child not only spoke English, but she knew about his confrontation with Colonel Harrington. She knew about his attempt to prevent the massacre that had cost him everything. "How do you," Jake began, but the girl cut him off with an urgent gesture. "The markings," she said, pointing to the intricate patterns painted on her face and arms. "They are sacred protection signs. My sister has them too. They mark us as children under the special protection of the spirits. When you rescued her, you became part of that protection." Jake didn't pretend to understand Apache's spiritual beliefs, but he could see that the girl believed what she was telling him with absolute conviction. More importantly, he could see that she was trying to tell him his life might not be forfeit after all. "Your people still want to kill me," Jake said as he positioned himself for the climb back up with her on his back. "Some do," the girl admitted, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. "But, the markings change everything. You have become a guardian of protected children. That makes you protected too, at least for now." As they began the treacherous ascent, Jake found himself wondering if he dared to hope. He had expected to die on this desert clifftop, and maybe he still would. But, the possibility that his act of rescue might have earned him something more than a quick death was almost too much to process. The girl was lighter than her younger sister, but she was also more aware of the danger they faced. Every time a handhold crumbled or a footrest shifted, Jake could feel her tense against his back. She whispered what sounded like prayers in Apache, and Jake found himself hoping that whatever spirits she was calling on were listening. They were almost to the top when disaster struck. A large section of the cliff face, weakened by Jake's repeated climbs, gave way all at once. For a terrifying moment they were falling, Jake's fingers scrabbling desperately for any kind of grip as rocks rained down around them. Then, strong hands grabbed Jake's wrists and hauled him and the girl up over the edge. The Apache warriors, working together, had pulled them both to safety just as the entire section of cliff they had been climbing collapsed into the canyon below. Jake lay on the solid ground, gasping for breath and hardly believing he was alive. The older girl rolled away from his back and immediately ran to embrace her father and younger sister, all three of them speaking rapidly in Apache while tears streamed down their faces. The war party leader approached Jake slowly, his rifle lowered but not forgotten. He studied the exhausted cowboy for a long moment, then spoke in careful English. "My daughters tell me you are the one who tried to stop the killing at Blue Creek. They say the spirits have marked you as a protector because of what you did today." Jake struggled to sit up, still breathing hard from the climb. "I don't know about spirits," he said honestly. "I just couldn't let those children die." The Apache leader nodded slowly. "That is what makes you a protector. Not the markings. Not the ceremonies. The choice to save children when you could have saved yourself." Jake looked around at the 7 warriors surrounding him. Their weapons were still ready, and he could see that not all of them agreed with their leader's assessment. Some of these men had probably lost family members at Blue Creek or other settlements. They had every reason to want his blood regardless of what his recent actions might have earned him. "So what happens now?" Jake asked. The leader was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the desert landscape where the sun was beginning to set. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of careful deliberation. "Now you must prove that your protection of our children was not just a single moment of conscience. You must prove that you are truly different from the soldiers who killed our people." Jake felt his heart sink. He had hoped for a quick death or an unexpected reprieve, not some impossible test that would only delay his inevitable execution. "What kind of proof?" "The kind that can only be given over time," the leader replied. "You will come with us. You will live among our people. You will help us protect our remaining children from soldiers like the ones you used to serve with. And, if you prove yourself worthy of the protection my daughters have claimed for you, then, perhaps you will find the redemption you seek. The offer was more than Jake had dared to hope for, but it was also more complicated than simple mercy. Living among the Apache would mean abandoning forever any hope of returning to the white world. It would mean learning new customs, new ways of thinking, new definitions of honor and duty. It would mean becoming something other than what he had always been. But, as Jake looked at the two girls he had rescued, seeing the sacred markings that had somehow transformed him from an enemy into something else, he realized that he had already become something different. The moment he had chosen to climb down that cliff face instead of fighting to the death, he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "I accept," Jake said simply. The Apache leader nodded as if he had expected no other answer. As the sun disappeared behind the western mountains and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake Morrison prepared to begin a new life among people he had once considered enemies. The transformation would not be easy, and there would be those among the Apache who would never accept him regardless of what the sacred markings might signify. But, for the first time since the massacre at Blue Creek, Jake felt something that had been missing from his life for far too long. Hope. 3 months had passed since Jake Morrison traded his cowboy hat for the headband of an Apache warrior, and every day brought new challenges that tested both his resolve and his welcome among the people he now called his own. The winter camp nestled in a hidden valley was unlike anything Jake had experienced in his years of frontier life, a community bound together by traditions that stretched back generations and a fierce determination to survive in a world that wanted them gone. Jake's transformation began with his name. The Apache called him Tsa, which meant one who climbs to save. The older girl he had rescued, who went by the English name of Maria when speaking to him, had chosen the name herself. She explained that in Apache tradition, a person's name should reflect their most important deed, and Jake's rescue of the children had defined him in their eyes. Learning to live as Tsa instead of Jake Morrison proved more difficult than he had anticipated. The language came slowly, full of sounds his English-speaking tongue struggled to master. The customs seemed to change depending on who he was talking to and what the situation required. Even something as simple as how to sit around the fire required careful attention to Apache etiquette and social hierarchy. But the hardest part wasn't learning new ways, it was unlearning the old ones. Jake had to constantly fight against instincts developed through years of military training and cowboy life. When the camp prepared to move, his first impulse was to pack light and move fast like a cavalry unit. The Apache way was different, slower, more deliberate, with careful attention to leaving no traces that pursuing soldiers could follow. Chief Standing Bear, the leader of their small band, was a patient teacher but a demanding one. He made it clear that accepting Jake into the tribe was not the same as trusting him. Every day brought small tests, opportunities for Jake to prove that his loyalty had truly shifted from the blue uniforms he once wore to the people he now lived among. "A man's heart can change," Standing Bear told him one evening as they sat outside the chief's wickiup watching the stars emerge. "But, changing a heart and proving it has changed are different things. Words are wind. Only actions speak truth." Jake was getting his chance to let his actions speak. Colonel Harrington's troops had been spotted 2 days' ride to the north, moving in a search pattern that suggested they were hunting for something specific. Or someone specific. Jake had no doubt that his former commanding officer was still eager to silence the only witness to the Blue Creek massacre, and that meant the Apache camp was in danger as long as he remained with them. "I should leave," Jake had told Standing Bear when the scouts brought news of the approaching soldiers. "Draw them away from your people." But the chief had shaken his head firmly. "You are under protection now. To abandon that protection would dishonor my daughters and anger the spirits. Besides," he added with something that might have been humor, "if you leave now, how will you prove you have truly chosen us over them?" The test came sooner than expected. Jake was returning from a hunting trip with 2 of the younger warriors when they saw smoke rising from the direction of the winter camp. Not the thin, controlled smoke of cooking fires, but the thick, dark smoke of burning structures. Jake's heart clenched as he thought of Maria and her younger sister Little Dove, of the old women who had been teaching him to weave baskets, of the children who had started calling him uncle despite their parents' reservations. The three men spurred their horses toward the camp, but, even before they crested the ridge that overlooked the valley, they could hear the sound of gunfire. Not the sporadic shots of hunters, but the rapid, organized volleys of military discipline. Colonel Harrington had found them. From their vantage point on the ridge, Jake could see the full scope of the disaster unfolding below. 2 companies of cavalry had surrounded the camp, and soldiers were methodically burning every wickiup and shelter they could find. The Apache were fighting back with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Women and children huddled behind whatever cover they could find while their men tried to hold off the blue-uniformed attackers. Jake's 2 companions, warriors named Swift Eagle and Iron Wolf, immediately began checking their weapons and preparing to charge into the battle. It was the Apache way, to die fighting rather than flee while their families were in danger. But, Jake grabbed Swift Eagle's bridle before the young man could spur his horse forward. "Wait," Jake said in careful Apache. "We cannot help them by dying uselessly. We need a plan." Iron Wolf gave Jake a look of contempt. "You speak like a coward. Like a white man who counts costs before fighting." The accusation stung because Jake could see the truth in it. His military training was making him think tactically when Apache honor demanded immediate action. But, he could also see that a frontal assault by 3 men against 2 companies would accomplish nothing except adding their bodies to the casualty count. "I am thinking like a man who wants to save our people instead of just dying with them," Jake replied, hoping his Apache was good enough to convey his meaning clearly. "Look there, by the horse lines. See how they have positioned their men." Jake pointed to where the soldiers had set up their command post. Colonel Harrington was clearly visible among the officers, directing the attack with the same cold efficiency he had shown at Blue Creek. The cavalry horses were bunched together under light guard, and Jake could see an opportunity that his years of military experience had taught him to recognize. "If we can scatter their horses, the soldiers will be stranded on foot," Jake explained. "Then, our people can escape into the high country where the blue coats cannot follow." Swift Eagle considered this, his anger warring with tactical sense. "And, how do 3 men scatter the horses of 2 companies?" Jake was already working out the details in his mind. The wind was blowing from the west, which meant a fire started in the right place would spread toward the horse lines. The soldiers were focused on the battle and wouldn't notice a small group approaching from the blind side of their position. It was risky, but it had a chance of working. "Fire," Jake said simply. "We start a grass fire upwind of their horses. The animals will panic and run. In the confusion, our people can escape." Iron Wolf spat on the ground. "Setting fires is not the way of a warrior. It is a trick. A deception. It is the way of a man who puts saving lives above personal glory," Jake shot back, his temper finally flaring. "You can die like a hero if you want, but I am going to try to actually help our people." The argument might have continued, but the sound of children screaming from the camp below cut through their debate like a knife. All 3 men could see soldiers advancing on the section of the camp where the women and children had taken refuge. There was no more time for discussion. Jake spurred his horse down the back side of the ridge, circling wide to approach the cavalry position from the west. After a moment's hesitation, Swift Eagle and Iron Wolf followed. They might doubt his methods, but they couldn't argue with his goal. The grass was dry from the winter months and caught fire easily when Jake touched a burning brand to it. The flames spread rapidly, pushed by the steady wind toward the cavalry horse lines. By the time the soldiers noticed the approaching fire, it was too late to move their animals to safety. The horses panicked exactly as Jake had predicted. Terrified by the smoke and flames, they broke free from their picket lines and scattered across the desert in all directions. Suddenly, 2 companies of cavalry were transformed into 2 companies of stranded infantry with no way to pursue the Apache when they inevitably fled into the mountains. But, Colonel Harrington was too experienced a commander to be completely undone by the loss of his horses. Even as his men scrambled to catch their mounts, he ordered a final assault on the Apache position. If he couldn't capture or kill all of them, he would at least eliminate as many as possible before they escaped. Jake watched in horror as soldiers advanced on the cluster of wickiups where he knew Maria and Little Dove were hiding with the other children. The Apache warriors were fighting desperately, but they were running low on ammunition and couldn't hold their positions much longer. In minutes, the children would be overrun. Without thinking, Jake drew his rifle and spurred his horse straight toward the advancing soldiers. He had no clear plan beyond placing himself between the blue coats and the children they were advancing on. Behind him, he could hear Swift Eagle and Iron Wolf shouting war cries as they followed him into the charge. The soldiers were startled by the sudden appearance of 3 riders attacking from their flank. Jake's first shot dropped a sergeant who was directing the assault on the children's position. His second shot shattered the rifle of a private who was taking aim at one of the Apache warriors. Then, he was among them, using his horse and his intimate knowledge of cavalry tactics to create as much chaos as possible. It wasn't really a fair fight. Jake had trained with these men, understood their methods, knew their weaknesses. He also had the advantage of desperation, the absolute certainty that failure meant death for the children he had sworn to protect. The soldiers, expecting to face only scattered Apache resistance, found themselves dealing with someone who fought like they did but thought like their enemy. The battle turned when Chief Standing Bear recognized what Jake was trying to do. Instead of continuing the defensive fight that was slowly being lost, the chief ordered his warriors to attack. With Jake's charge having disrupted the soldiers' formation, the Apache were able to break through and reach the women and children. Colonel Harrington himself appeared through the smoke and chaos, his face twisted with rage when he recognized his former subordinate. "Morrison," he shouted over the sound of gunfire. "I should have had you shot for treason months ago." Jake turned his horse to face his former commanding officer, and, for a moment the battle seemed to pause around them. Here was the confrontation that had been building since that terrible day at Blue Creek, the final accounting between 2 men who had once served the same flag but now stood on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide. "You should have listened to me at Blue Creek," Jake called back. "Those were children, not enemies." "They were Apache," Harrington snarled. "That made them enemies by birth. Just like you've made yourself an enemy by choice." The colonel raised his pistol, but Jake was faster. His rifle shot took Harrington in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. For a moment, Jake had a clear shot to finish the job, to eliminate the man who had ordered the massacre of innocents and who would undoubtedly order more if he lived. But, as Jake aimed for the killing shot, he heard Maria's voice calling his name. The girl was looking at him with eyes that seemed to see straight into his soul, and Jake realized that this moment would define not just whether he lived or died, but what kind of man he had chosen to become. He lowered his rifle without firing. "Tiasekadai." Maria called again, this time with urgency. "The children are safe. We must go." Jake looked around and saw that the Apache were already withdrawing, carrying their wounded and gathering their few portable possessions. The loss of their horses had left the soldiers unable to pursue effectively, and Chief Standing Bear was seizing the opportunity to lead his people to safety. Colonel Harrington was clutching his wounded shoulder and trying to reach his fallen pistol. "This isn't over, Morrison," he shouted as Jake turned his horse toward the escaping Apache. "I'll hunt you down. I'll see you hang for treason." "My name is Tiasekadai," Jake called back without looking. Jake Morrison died at Blue Creek. The escape into the high country was grueling. The Apache had saved most of their people, but they had lost their winter shelter and most of their stored food. The wounded slowed their progress, and everyone knew that more soldiers would come looking for them once word of the attack reached the territorial capital. But they were alive, and, for people who had been facing extinction, that was no small victory. As they climbed higher into the mountains where cavalry horses couldn't follow, Jake found himself riding beside Chief Standing Bear. "You had a chance to kill the soldier chief," the older man observed quietly. "Why did you choose not to?" Jake considered the question carefully. The honest answer was that he wasn't entirely sure himself. Military logic suggested that eliminating Harrington would have been the practical choice. Apache justice certainly would have supported it after what the man had done at Blue Creek. "Because Maria was watching," Jake finally said. "And, I didn't want her to see me become a killer again." Standing Bear nodded slowly. "The protection marks on my daughters saved your life when you rescued them. But, what you just did saved something more important than your life. It saved your spirit from becoming like the men you once served with." As night fell and, the Apache made their cold camp in a high mountain meadow, Jake reflected on how much had changed since that day on the cliff when he first heard the children crying for help. He had thought then, that saving them might earn him a quick death instead of a slow one. He never imagined that it would lead him to this moment, sitting around an Apache fire as Cowboy instead of Jake Morrison, accepted not just as a refugee but, as a protector. The test wasn't over. Jake knew that other challenges lay ahead, other opportunities to prove that his transformation was real and, lasting. Colonel Harrington would keep his promise to hunt them down, and, there would be more battles, more choices between the old ways and, the new. But, tonight, with Maria and, Little Dove safe beside their father's fire and, the sacred protection marks still visible on their skin, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in months of living among the Apache. He felt like he belonged. The children he had saved him in return, but, not in the way he had first thought. They hadn't just kept him from dying on that clifftop. They had shown him how to live as a different kind of man entirely. As Jake settled into his blankets under the vast canopy of mountain stars, he whispered a prayer in the Apache language he was still learning. It was a prayer of thanksgiving for protection received and, guidance given, for the chance to choose redemption over revenge and, hope over despair. Tomorrow would bring new dangers and, new tests. But, tonight, for the first time since Blue Creek, Jake Morrison slept without nightmares. Cowboy, the one who climbs to save, dreamed instead of children's laughter and, a future where protection meant more than just survival. The sacred markings had indeed saved his life, but, more importantly, they had shown him what his life could mean when it was dedicated to saving others. In learning to be a guardian of Apache children, Jake had discovered how to be guardian of his own soul as well. The transformation was far from complete, but, the foundation was solid. Built on the trust of two young girls and, the wisdom of a chief who understood that redemption was not a destination but, a daily choice, Jake had found his path forward. Whatever trials lay ahead, he would face them not as a deserter running from his past, but, as a protector running toward his future. Spring came late to the high country, but, when it finally arrived, it brought more than just melting snow and, new grass. It brought riders carrying news that would test everything Jake had learned about his new life as Cowboy, protector of Apache children and, guardian of sacred promises. The winter had been hard on Chief Standing Bear's band. Food had been scarce, and, the cold mountain air had claimed 3 of the elderly and, 1 infant who couldn't survive the harsh conditions. The survivors were tougher for the ordeal, but, they were also fewer in number and, running low on the supplies they needed to maintain their traditional way of life. Jake had spent the cold months learning more than just language and, customs. Under the patient guidance of an old warrior named Grey Wolf, he had discovered skills he never knew he possessed. His hands, once used only for handling ropes and, rifles, learned to craft arrows with points sharp enough to bring down deer. His eyes, trained to spot cattle rustlers across open range, learned to read the subtle signs that told the story of every animal and, human who had passed through Apache territory. Most importantly, he had learned to think like an Apache father rather than a white soldier. When Maria and, Little Dove brought him problems or questions, his first instinct was no longer to solve them with authority and, orders. Instead, he listened carefully and, helped them find their own answers, the way Apache children were traditionally taught to become strong and, independent adults. The girls had grown during the winter months, not just in size but in the confidence that came from surviving real hardship. Maria, at 13, was beginning to show the signs of approaching womanhood, and her opinions carried weight in family discussions. Little Dove, now 10, had developed a reputation as the fastest runner in the band and often served as a messenger when speed was more important than stealth. Both girls still bore the sacred protection markings that had first saved Jake's life, but the meanings had deepened over the months. What had started as symbols of spiritual protection had become visible reminders of the bonds that tied their small family together. When Jake looked at those intricate patterns painted on their arms and faces, he saw not just Apache tradition but his own transformation from enemy to guardian. The news that shattered their mountain peace came with two Chiricahua Apache warriors who had ridden hard from the south. They brought word that the American government was offering a reward of $500 for information leading to the capture of Jake Morrison, the army deserter who had betrayed his own people to help the Apache. More troubling still, they reported that Colonel Harrington had convinced his superiors that Jake possessed crucial intelligence about Apache hiding places and military weaknesses. "They say you know all our secrets because you lived among us," Grey Wolf translated as the messenger spoke in rapid Apache. "The soldier chief tells them you are more dangerous than a war party because you understand both white and Apache ways of fighting." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The reward was large enough to tempt even friendly traders and Mexican civilians who might otherwise look the other way when Apache bands moved through their territory. But, worse than the money was the implication behind Harrington's claims, that Jake was valuable because he was a traitor who could reveal Apache secrets to white authorities. "What will you do?" Chief Standing Bear asked that evening as the men of the band gathered to discuss their options. "The colonel speaks truth about one thing. You do know our ways now. You know where we hunt, where we hide, where our sacred places are located. If the soldiers capture you..." The chief didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood that torture could break even the strongest man eventually, and Jake's knowledge of Apache survival methods could be used to hunt down not just their own small band but every Apache group still trying to live free in the territory. Some of the younger warriors argued that Jake should leave immediately, taking the danger with him before soldiers could track them to their mountain refuge. Others suggested that they should move deeper into Mexico, beyond the reach of American bounty hunters. A few even whispered that they should consider turning Jake over to the authorities themselves, collecting the reward money to buy supplies their people desperately needed. Jake listened to the debate with growing heaviness in his heart. He had known this moment would come eventually, the time when his presence among the Apache would endanger the very people he had sworn to protect. The logical solution was obvious, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. "I'll leave at first light," Jake announced when the discussion reached a natural pause. "Head south into Mexico, maybe keep going until I reach South America. Draw the hunt away from all of you." But Maria, who had been sitting quietly with the other women and children, suddenly stood up and walked into the circle of men. In Apache society, young women did not typically interrupt councils of war, but Maria's special status as one of the children Jake had rescued gave her the right to speak. "Tsa cannot leave," she said firmly, using Jake's Apache name with the authority of someone making a pronouncement rather than offering an opinion. "The sacred markings bind him to us, and us to him. To break that bond would anger the spirits and bring bad fortune to our people." Chief Standing Bear looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. "The markings protected him when he chose to save you and your sister. But now his presence puts all our children at risk. Sometimes protection requires separation." "No, father," Maria replied with a respect that didn't diminish her certainty. "The markings didn't just protect Tsa from us. They marked him as a guardian. A guardian does not run away when the children face danger. A guardian finds a way to make the children safer." Little Dove had followed her older sister into the council circle, and now she added her own voice to the argument. "Tsa taught us that sometimes the best way to protect people is to do something that looks like the wrong thing. Like when he didn't kill the bad soldier chief even though the man deserved to die. Jake looked at the two girls who had changed his life so completely, seeing in their faces the wisdom that Apache children learned from growing up in a world where survival depended on understanding the difference between short-term solutions and long-term consequences. They were right, of course. Running away might temporarily reduce the immediate danger, but it would also leave them defenseless against future threats. What do you suggest? Jake asked, genuinely curious about what alternative these young minds might have conceived. Maria exchanged a glance with her sister, and Jake could see that they had already discussed this possibility between themselves. We suggest that you stop hiding and start hunting instead. The idea was audacious enough to silence the entire council. Instead of fleeing from Colonel Harrington's pursuit, Maria was proposing that Jake turn the tables and become the pursuer himself. It was the kind of tactical reversal that military minds could appreciate, but it was also incredibly dangerous. Explain, Chief Standing Bear commanded, and Jake could hear in the chief's voice the same mixture of parental concern and tactical curiosity that he himself was feeling. The soldier chief wants Tsa because he thinks our guardian will betray Apache secrets, Maria said, speaking now with the careful precision of someone presenting a formal argument. But, what if instead of learning our secrets, the soldier chief learned lies? What if Tsa appeared to be captured but was actually free to control what information the soldiers received? Jake began to understand the audacious scope of what Maria was suggesting. She wanted him to allow himself to be captured, or appear to be captured, so that he could feed false information to the military while actually serving as a spy for the Apache. It was a deception that could work, but it would require Jake to convincingly play the role of a broken man willing to betray his adopted people. The risk is too great, Grey Wolf objected. If the deception is discovered, they will kill him slowly. And, how could he escape to bring us the information he learns? The same way he escaped from the army before, Little Dove said with the confidence of youth. He is smarter than they are, and they think they already know what kind of man he is. They won't expect him to be different. Jake found himself seriously considering the plan despite its obvious dangers. The more he thought about it, the more he could see possibilities that the girls might not have fully realized. If he could convince Harrington that he was willing to cooperate, he might be able to learn about future military operations against Apache bands. He might even be able to misdirect those operations, sending soldiers to empty canyons while the real Apache camps remained safe. There's another advantage, Jake said slowly as the plan took shape in his mind. Harrington wants me because he thinks I'm valuable as a traitor. But, he also wants me dead because I'm the only witness to what happened at Blue Creek. If I'm his prisoner, he can't kill me without losing the intelligence he thinks I can provide. That gives me protection, at least for a while. Chief Standing Bear listened to the discussion with the thoughtful expression of a leader weighing a decision that could affect the lives of everyone in his care. Finally, he spoke with the gravity that Apache chiefs brought to matters of life and death. This plan could save many Apache lives if it succeeds. But, it could also cost us our most trusted guardian if it fails. The choice must be yours, Tsa. But, know that whatever you decide, you do so with the blessing of our people. Jake looked around the circle of faces illuminated by the flickering fire, seeing in each one the trust and acceptance he had worked so hard to earn over the winter months. These people were willing to risk losing him because they believed in his ability to protect them even from inside an army prison. The faith they were showing was both humbling and terrifying. I need to think about the details, Jake said finally. If we're going to do this, it has to be perfect. One mistake and everyone here dies. Over the next 3 days, Jake and the council worked out an elaborate deception that would require precise timing and no small amount of luck. The plan called for Jake to stage his own capture in a way that would make Harrington believe he had been betrayed by Mexican bounty hunters seeking the reward. A carefully prepared story would explain how Jake had been living alone in the desert, cut off from Apache contact and slowly starving. Desperate and broken, he would be ready to trade information for better treatment. The key to selling the deception was making Jake look the part of a man who had been surviving alone for months. Gray Wolf, who had experience with disguise and misdirection from his younger days as a scout, helped Jake prepare for the role. They tore his clothes and exposed him to sun and wind until his skin had the weathered look of someone living rough. They coached him on how to move like a man weakened by hunger and how to speak like someone whose spirit had been broken by isolation and despair. Maria and Little Dove contributed their own touches to the disguise, using their knowledge of white attitudes toward Indians to suggest ways Jake could make his story more believable. They reminded him that soldiers would expect a white man living among Apache to gradually adopt Indian ways, so Jake should show signs of that cultural contamination. They braided small feathers into his hair and gave him Apache ornaments that would be obvious to any military observer. The hardest part was saying goodbye without knowing if they would ever see each other again. Jake had grown to love these people not just as his saviors but as his family. The thought of living among enemies while pretending to betray the Apache felt like a betrayal of everything he had become over the winter months. Remember, Maria told him on the last evening before the plan was to be implemented, "You are not really betraying us. You are protecting us by making our enemies believe lies instead of truth. The spirits know your true heart, and that is what matters." Little Dove gave him a small carved wooden horse, a gift she had been working on in secret during the winter evenings. "To remember that you are always welcome in our home," she said simply, and Jake had to turn away to hide the emotion in his eyes. The actual capture was staged at a water hole 2 days' ride south of their mountain camp. Jake allowed himself to be surprised by Mexican bounty hunters who were actually Swift Eagle and Iron Wolf in disguise. After a brief, choreographed fight that left Jake unconscious and his captors victorious, the fake bounty hunters delivered their prize to the nearest army outpost. Colonel Harrington arrived within hours of receiving word that Jake Morrison had been captured. The man's satisfaction was evident as he looked down at his former subordinate, now dressed in rags and apparently broken by months of hardship in the desert. "So," Harrington said with cold triumph, "the great Indian lover finally comes home. I hope your Apache friends were worth what they're going to cost you." Jake looked up at his former commanding officer with eyes that he hoped showed defeat rather than the burning hatred he actually felt. "They never accepted me anyway," he lied in a voice carefully crafted to sound tired and bitter. "Always treated me like a white outsider who didn't understand their ways. I figure it's time to come back to my own people." It was a convincing performance, but Jake knew that the real test was just beginning. Harrington wasn't going to trust him immediately, and every conversation would be a careful dance between giving enough information to seem cooperative and protecting the secrets that could destroy the people he really served. As the cell door clanged shut behind him, Jake fingered the small wooden horse hidden in his pocket and reminded himself that he was exactly where he needed to be. The girl's plan was risky and dangerous, but it was also the only way to protect the Apache children who depended on him. For the first time since leaving his mountain home, Jake allowed himself a small smile. Colonel Harrington thought he had finally captured his elusive prey, but what he had really done was invite a guardian into the heart of his operations. The sacred markings that had saved Jake's life on that cliff were about to save many more lives in ways that no one could have imagined. The hunter had become the hunted, but the hunted was not what he appeared to be. In the game of deception that was about to begin, Jake held advantages that his captors couldn't possibly understand. He was no longer just Jake Morrison, army deserter. He was TSA Cowboy, guardian of Apache children, and he was about to prove that protection sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice, the willingness to appear to become the enemy in order to defeat him. 6 weeks into his captivity, Jake Morrison, or TSA Cowboy as he still thought of himself in quiet moments, had become Colonel Harrington's most valuable asset in the war against the Apache. At least, that's what Harrington believed. In reality, every piece of information Jake provided was carefully crafted to lead soldiers away from Apache camps while appearing to offer genuine intelligence about enemy movements and hiding places. The deception was working better than Jake had dared to hope. Harrington's trust had grown steadily as Jake fed him a mixture of real but outdated information and complete fabrications designed to waste military resources. 3 separate cavalry expeditions had been sent to investigate Jake's reports of Apache camps, and all 3 had returned empty-handed after searching canyons and valleys that had been abandoned months earlier. "Your information is getting better," Harrington said during one of their daily interrogation sessions. "The tracks my men found in Dead Horse Canyon were definitely Apache. Fresh, too. We just missed them." Jake nodded wearily, maintaining the facade of a broken man eager to please his captors. "They move fast this time of year. Spring grass means their horses are strong again. But, I know their patterns. Give me a few more days to think, and I can tell you where they're likely to head next." What Jake didn't tell Harrington was that those tracks had been deliberately left by Swift Eagle and Iron Wolf, who were monitoring the army's movements and creating false trails to support Jake's deceptions. The entire Apache band was actually 50 miles north of Dead Horse Canyon, safely hidden in a mountain valley that Jake had never mentioned in any of his reports. But, maintaining the deception was taking a toll that Jake hadn't anticipated. Living surrounded by enemies while pretending to betray the people he loved was eating away at his spirit day by day. He had to listen to soldiers discussing their plans to kill Apache families with the same casual tone they might use to talk about hunting deer. He had to nod and smile when Harrington praised him for his cooperation, knowing that the praise was based on lies designed to protect the very people Harrington wanted to destroy. The worst moments came when Jake was forced to provide information that was true but harmless, details about Apache customs and beliefs that would make his other lies seem more credible. Each time he spoke about sacred ceremonies or traditional hunting grounds, he felt like he was selling pieces of his soul to maintain his cover. The strain was starting to show despite his best efforts. Jake caught himself staring too long at the horizon when he was allowed outside, obviously thinking about somewhere else. He had to be careful about his reactions when soldiers discussed particularly brutal plans for dealing with Apache prisoners. Most dangerous of all, he found himself unconsciously reaching for the small wooden horse that Little Dove had given him, the gesture becoming a nervous habit that he had to constantly monitor. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in late spring when a new prisoner was brought into the fort. Jake was in the courtyard, supposedly helping the quartermaster identify Apache artifacts that had been seized in various raids, when the gates opened to admit a cavalry patrol with a captive. The prisoner was a young Apache woman, perhaps 20 years old, with the bearing of someone who had never learned to accept defeat. Even bound and surrounded by soldiers, she held her head high and met the stares of her captors with fierce dignity. What made Jake's blood run cold was not her courage, but the intricate markings visible on her face and arms, markings he recognized immediately. She was one of the protected children, a bearer of the sacred symbols that had saved his life and bound him to the Apache people. Somehow, this young woman was connected to Maria and Little Dove, part of the spiritual network that had transformed him from enemy to guardian. Jake forced himself to show no recognition, continuing to examine the artifacts spread before him as if the new prisoner's arrival was of no interest. But, inside, his mind was racing. How had she been captured? Was she alone, or were there others? Most importantly, did her presence here mean that Chief Standing Bear's band had been discovered despite all of Jake's efforts to misdirect the army's search? The answers came that evening when Jake was called to Harrington's office for what the colonel described as a special consultation. The young woman was already there, sitting in chains while 2 guards watched her carefully. Her eyes met Jake's as he entered, and, for just a moment he saw a flicker of recognition. She knew who he was, which meant she knew he was supposed to be her protector. "This is the Apache woman we captured yesterday," Harrington explained, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a hunter who had bagged a particularly prized trophy. "My men tell me she's not just any savage, she's got those markings that indicate high status in their society. I want you to question her, find out what she knows about current Apache positions." Jake felt the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Here was the ultimate test of his deception, the point where his 2 loyalties would collide with devastating force. If he refused to interrogate the woman, Harrington would become suspicious. If he pretended to interrogate her but learned nothing useful, the colonel might decide she was worthless and order her killed. But, if he actually extracted information from her, he would be betraying everything he had sworn to protect. "What's her name?" Jake asked, stalling for time while he tried to think of a solution. "She won't tell us," one of the guards reported. "Hasn't said a word since we brought her in. Just stares at everyone like she's planning to kill them." Jake studied the woman more carefully, noting details that the soldiers would have missed. Her clothing showed signs of long travel, but it wasn't the rough wear of someone living as a fugitive. Her hair was arranged in a style that indicated she had been preparing for some kind of ceremony before her capture. Most telling of all, her hands showed calluses and patterns that suggested she was skilled in traditional women's crafts, weaving, pottery, leatherwork. "She's not a warrior," Jake said, allowing some of his genuine expertise to show through. "Look at her hands, her posture. This is a craftswoman, probably someone important in the social structure of her band. The kind of person who would know about camps and movements because she helps plan the practical aspects of tribal life." It was all true, but it was also exactly the kind of information that would make Harrington more determined to extract intelligence from the prisoner. Jake could see the calculation in the colonel's eyes as he absorbed this assessment. "Good," Harrington said with satisfaction. "That means she's worth the effort it will take to make her talk. I'm putting you in charge of her interrogation, Morrison. Use whatever methods you think will be effective. I want to know where her people are camped and how many warriors they have." Jake felt the trap closing around him, but he also saw a possibility that might save both the prisoner and his own mission. "I'll need time with her. These people don't respond well to immediate pressure. If I push too hard too fast, she'll just shut down completely." "How much time?" Harrington asked impatiently. "A few days, maybe a week. Let me establish rapport first, show her that cooperation will be better for her than resistance. Once she starts talking, the information will flow more freely." Harrington considered this, clearly torn between his desire for immediate results and his growing trust in Jake's expertise about Apache psychology. Finally, he nodded reluctantly. 1 week. But, I want daily reports on your progress. And, if she doesn't start providing useful intelligence by then, we'll try more direct methods." Jake knew exactly what more direct methods meant, and the knowledge made his stomach clench with sick dread. He had 1 week to find a way to save this woman without destroying his mission or exposing himself as a double agent. It seemed impossible, but he had learned over the winter months that impossible things sometimes became possible when guided by the right kind of faith. That night, alone in the storage room that had been converted into an interrogation chamber, Jake finally had his chance to speak privately with the Apache woman. She watched him warily as he approached, clearly uncertain whether he was the ally her markings proclaimed him to be or another enemy wearing a familiar face. "My name is Tsekadai," Jake said quietly in Apache, using the name that identified him as a guardian of protected children. "I climbed down a cliff to save 2 girls marked like you are marked." The woman's eyes widened slightly, and Jake could see the tension in her shoulders ease just a fraction. She had heard the story of his rescue of Maria and Little Dove. Probably everyone in the Apache community knew about the white soldier who had chosen to become a protector rather than a killer. "I am called Bright Star," she replied in careful Apache, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am sister to the wife of Chief Standing Bear. I came looking for you when the spirits told me you were in danger." Jake felt his heart sink as he realized the full scope of the disaster that had befallen his carefully laid plans. Bright Star hadn't been captured by accident, she had deliberately entered dangerous territory to find him, probably because some Apache spiritual tradition had warned her that his mission was failing or that he needed help. "How did you know where to find me?" Jake asked, dreading the answer. "The dreams," Bright Star said simply. "The spirits showed me that you were forgetting who you truly are. Living among enemies, pretending to be their friend, was poisoning your spirit. They sent me to remind you of your true nature before the poison could kill the guardian inside you." Jake understood immediately what she meant. The strain of maintaining his deception had indeed been affecting him in ways he hadn't fully recognized. He had been so focused on protecting his cover that he had started to lose touch with the man he had become among the Apache. The constant lies and false friendships were slowly eroding his sense of himself as Tsa, replacing that identity with something closer to the old Jake Morrison. "I have been faithful to my mission," Jake protested, but, even as he said it, he could hear the defensiveness in his voice. "Have you?" Bright Star asked gently. "When did you last think of Little Dove's laughter instead of the Colonel's approval? When did you last remember the taste of food cooked over an Apache fire instead of army rations? The spirits do not judge you for the lies you tell your enemies. But, they are concerned that you are starting to believe some of those lies yourself." The accusation hit Jake like a physical blow because he could see the truth in it. Somewhere in the weeks of deception and false camaraderie, he had indeed started to lose pieces of his Apache identity. He still remembered his mission, still carefully crafted his lies to protect Standing Bear's people, but the emotional connection to that life had been fading without his conscious awareness. "The dreams also showed me something else," Bright Star continued. "They showed me that your mission here will soon be complete, but not in the way you planned. The Colonel's trust in you has become a trap that will destroy him, but only if you remember who you truly are at the moment of choice." Jake wasn't sure what she meant by the moment of choice, but he could see that Bright Star believed she had been sent here for reasons beyond just reminding him of his true identity. There was a purpose to her capture that neither of them fully understood yet, but that would become clear when the time was right. "How do I get you out of here?" Jake asked, focusing on the immediate problem. "You don't," Bright Star said firmly. "I am here because the spirits wanted me here. When my purpose is fulfilled, they will provide a way for me to leave. Your job is not to rescue me but to remember who you are and trust that everything is happening as it should." Over the next 3 days, Jake conducted mock interrogation sessions with Bright Star while actually receiving spiritual counseling designed to restore his connection to his Apache identity. She told him stories from the winter camp, reminding him of the children he was protecting and the life that waited for him when his mission was complete. She taught him traditional songs and prayers that he could recite silently during the most difficult moments of his deception. Most importantly, she helped him understand that his feelings of spiritual corruption were actually a sign that his Apache identity was strong enough to recognize when it was under threat. A true traitor wouldn't feel guilty about betraying his people. The fact that Jake was struggling with the deception proved that his transformation from soldier to guardian had been real and lasting. On the 4th day, Jake's carefully constructed web of lies finally produced the opportunity that Bright Star had predicted. Colonel Harrington burst into the interrogation room with news that changed everything. "We've got them," Harrington announced triumphantly. "Your Apache woman finally gave us something useful. She told us about a hidden canyon where her people store supplies for winter. My scouts confirmed it. There are caves full of food and ammunition, everything the savages need to survive. We're going to destroy it all and leave them to starve." Jake felt his blood turn to ice as he realized what had happened. Somehow, Bright Star had known that Harrington would demand information from her directly if Jake's gentle interrogation seemed to be failing. She had deliberately provided the Colonel with intelligence about a real Apache cache, but she had done it for reasons that Jake didn't yet understand. "When do we move?" Jake asked, struggling to keep his voice calm. "Tonight," Harrington replied. "I'm taking 2 companies, enough men to handle any warriors who might be guarding the cache. You're coming with us as a guide. This is your chance to prove your loyalty once and for all by helping us strike a real blow against your former friends." As Harrington left to prepare for the mission, Jake turned to Bright Star with confusion and growing alarm. "Why did you tell him about the cache? That food was meant for families, for children." "Because," Bright Star said with calm certainty, "the cache is empty. We moved everything 2 weeks ago when the spirits warned us that it would be discovered. But, the Colonel doesn't know that. He will take his best men far away from the fort to attack shadows while leaving his real prize unguarded. Jake began to understand the elegant trap that had been set. You mean to escape while he's gone? We mean to do more than escape, Bright Star corrected. The spirits showed me that this fort contains something more valuable than my freedom. Hidden in the colonel's office are papers that list the locations of every Apache band the army has discovered. If those papers fall into the wrong hands, every free Apache in the territory will be hunted down and killed. Jake felt the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. His mission had never been just about feeding false information to the army. It had been about positioning himself to strike a decisive blow at the right moment, and that moment was now at hand. What do you need me to do? Jake asked. Remember who you are, Bright Star said simply. When the time comes to choose between protecting your cover and protecting our people, choose as TSA Cowboy would choose, not as Jake Morrison would choose. The spirits have brought us both to this moment for a reason. Trust in that reason, even if you cannot see the full plan. That night, as Colonel Harrington's expedition rode out into the darkness toward an empty cache in a distant canyon, Jake prepared for the most dangerous mission of his life. He would have one chance to steal the intelligence reports that could destroy every remaining Apache band in the territory. If he succeeded, his people would be safe. If he failed, his false identity would be exposed and, both he and Bright Star would die slowly under torture. But, as Jake made his final preparations, fingering the small wooden horse that Little Dove had given him, he felt a calm certainty settle over his spirit. The sacred markings had indeed saved his life, but their protection had never been limited to physical safety. They had saved him from becoming a killer of children, saved him from a life without meaning, and, now they would save him one last time by giving him the courage to complete his transformation from soldier to guardian. Tomorrow, Jake Morrison would cease to exist entirely. Only TSA Cowboy would remain, the one who climbs to save, the guardian of Apache children, the man who had learned that the greatest protection sometimes required the greatest sacrifice. The girl's markings had brought him this far. Faith in their wisdom would carry him the rest of the way home. As the last sounds of the departing cavalry faded into the distance, Jake began his approach to the colonel's office, moving through the shadows like the Apache warrior he had become. The final test was about to begin, and, for the first time since this whole deception started, Jake knew exactly who he was and what he had to do. The guardian was coming home, and he was bringing the protection his children needed with him.